Ohio State has found its ninth athletic director. Gene Smith will be retiring on June 30th, and starting July 1st, Ross Bjork will be taking over for him. Ross Bjork, Nathan, spent the last 5 years, I believe, at Texas A&M. Tell us more about this guy.
Yeah, I guess that's the first thing to know. He's 51 years old. He has been in the SEC, leading SEC programs the last 12 years. Was at Ole Miss for 7 years before being at Texas A&M for the last 5. And that's obviously substantial experience with high-level football. I think it's maybe first and foremost. He played fullback at Emporia State in Kansas, so he's a football guy at heart. And coming from now the SEC for the past dozen years, I think it's an interesting choice for Ohio State from that perspective to go outside of the maybe Midwest or Big Ten comfort zone, certainly outside the comfort zone of the Gene Smith AD tree that he'd been putting together over the past 2 decades, and get someone with a different perspective on things like NIL, things like how you fund football, how you use funds for football and disperse things, and how you the high expectations are not a new thing for him. You know, he's coming from a place where even if the results have not been great at Texas A&M, the amount of money that they spend to hire Jimbo Fisher and certainly extend him, and the expectations of that program are still massive, which is why it has seemed so much like they have underachieved in the past several years, including the past 5 while he was there. So from a football perspective, it's someone who comes in with some familiarity of what people are going to expect Ohio State to be, and what they're going to expect Ohio State to, how they're going to expect Ohio State to act and treat football on a daily basis.
So, Andrew, I think one of the more important questions that people are going to be asking is, okay, what does this mean for Ohio State's NIL? And there's probably a deeper conversation that you can have about that we're going to have to get into more than just the 5 to 10 minutes we do this video here. But Bjork's coming from Texas A&M, where 2 years ago they had the highest rated class in the country. Can a hire like this, just based on his experience in some of the places he's been, be a good thing for where Ohio State's and where they are in NIL space in terms of Ohio State football recruiting? Is this headed in the right direction?
It can be a good thing. I don't want to say that it is or it isn't, because go look at Texas A&M's 2022 class. They had 30 kids join that class. Just listen to the rankings of these kids: 2, 9, 11, 14, 17, 22, 23, 25, 39, 47. Like, you're bringing in an egregious amount of top 50 talent, and a lot of those guys are gone, right? A lot of those guys are no longer with the Aggies. So there is a good and a bad to this, right? The good news is that you've got somebody who is familiar with the college football modern day recruiting. You got somebody who kind of is familiar with heading up a supremely significant NIL program. That's a big deal. That's a good thing for Ohio State. It also has to be a situation where, look, you have a NIL program that gives money to the right players and can set up things for the best interest of Ohio State in the short term and the long term. Because with Texas A&M, for example, you can see, hey, look, there are players that, maybe Texas A&M just kind of threw money at and it didn't really work out. And you got to avoid that situation. You look at, recruiting over the last couple of tenures that he's had. He was at Ole Miss before he was at Texas A&M. He was at Ole Miss from 2012 to 2019. While he was there, Ole Miss vacated 33 wins due to recruiting violations. So there is a lot going on with recruiting. And now that we are in this modern age where, certain things like that might not be as prevalent because recruiting is more legal than it was, 10, 15 years ago, there's a backstory to this that Ohio State can kind of benefit from. And I think that the good news for Ohio State is that you've got somebody who is certainly ready and willing and kind of knows the game for how to get involved in this NIL space.
On the NIL point, I don't know how much the AD would be like involved in the decisions that are made at the later stages, right? Like after it's more about setting up the system. And he was just as Gene Smith was involved in Ohio, Ross Bjork was instrumental in Texas, along with, I'm sure, the other ADs there, of getting that state's law written in 2021. And I actually don't know off the top of my head yet. We'll look into that, like how much the landscape differentiated differentiated because there can be some differences between states. I think what's more important is just the fact that they got this robust thing up and going. Now, the caveat being, there's a difference. People that I've been talking to in the NIL space since this all started for Ohio State, but even in recent weeks, as I've been looking into this, have made the point that schools in the South were a little bit more set up by their culture to be out in front on NIL. And I think now Ohio State is catching up, obviously. So maybe that point won't be as important at this point. But I think it could still be a little bit instrumental here too, or a little bit informative for Ohio State going forward, that this is someone with that perspective. What can Ohio State do while still perhaps operating with the same guidance and prudence and caution that Gene Smith has brought to that? And sometimes people thought that is too much, and I understand. I would also say we look at it sometimes from like, well, these things happened on his watch. You know, the Hugh Freeze stuff at Ole Miss, at least the back end of it, the violation uncovering by the NCAA and in his ultimate firing happened on Bjork's watch. The extension of Jimbo Fisher at Texas A&M that just led to a $76 million buyout, that happened on his watch. I do think, I wonder, and we'll find out more. He's got a press conference on Wednesday at noon, whether he wants a situation where maybe the AD has a little bit more control to set up a place where the inmates aren't running the asylum, for lack of a better term. That maybe like there are places where the boosters have a lot more money and throw their money around, but that means a lot more control and they exert it. So I'm just speculating on that. I have not talked to Ross Bjork yet. We will hopefully do that Wednesday afternoon. But I'm wondering if that is sort of the marriage that could be happening here. Someone who knows how this stuff works at the places where they have tapped into those donor resources better, booster resources better, but also maybe wants to be at a place where it's done with a little bit more sanity, and maybe there isn't a middle ground there to be found, but maybe that's what he's looking for. Maybe that's what Ohio State's looking for as well.
And there's that search there, because it does feel like in places in the South, it is the extreme one way when you're having these NIL conversations, while sometimes at northern schools, at times it's felt like it's extreme the other way, one way extremely aggressive with it, the other way maybe extremely conservative with it. And maybe if you felt like even at Ohio State at times, it's like you weren't as aggressive with it as maybe you wanted it to be in terms of where you're suggesting boosters go in terms of where they spend their money at. Are they spending it necessarily within the university or in these NIL collectives? Maybe a guy who has seen the other side of it is the guy who can maybe bridge that a little bit. And you do see a little bit more of a middle ground conversation, whereas to your point, Nathan, boosters aren't running your program because that's what you don't want. Because then you turn into what Texas turned into for a couple of years there. You don't want boosters running your program, but you do want to be able to keep up in spaces and not feel like you get the signing day, especially on the recruiting trail, where you get the signing day and there's like 4 or 5 guys where you feel like the difference was you could not keep up in the NIL space, and so you lost that on those guys. Now, Ohio State, as you said, Nathan, is already starting to catch up in those fronts, but bringing a guy from the South who has seen it from that style, seen it from that side of things, can maybe expedite that process a little bit more.
You know, I thought it was very interesting that when Gene Smith retired, the day he retired, everybody very quickly pivoted to the like I said before, that Gene Smith AD tree, like all these people, men and women of various backgrounds that he had just sort of scattered across the country and were ADs at either Power 5 places, or someone like Diana Sabau, who is at a smaller, for her first AD job right now, but had been at the Big Ten. But you're talking about Martin Jarmon, you're talking about Patrick Chun, who people, it's been reported he did, I believe, have one of the 3 finalists that interviewed for this job. Heather Lyke at Pitt. Like, there were all these people out there that you could have chosen from. And I think that it's kind of informative that this, and it was like a 15-member search committee that's been working on this since October, and then Ted Carter, the president, that comes in here in January, and they sort of finished the job here, and I'm sure he was having some sort of background involvement before that. I'd be surprised if he wasn't. Went in a different direction. Like, they went completely away from the the inner circle or the proteges that Gene Smith has been putting together over the past 20 years. And I know there are people around Ohio State who are disappointed by that because they were big fans of some of the people, including Pat Chun. But I also think that if you step back and look at it, it's like, okay, well, if you're trying to do, if you're really making a leadership change, then maybe you should really make a leadership change. Like this guy's leaving after 20 years. You've had the same ethic and voice that's been overseeing your program for 20 years. And what are you going to do in the future? Do you want that coming from a new perspective, a new voice that's leading that? You got to be careful who you get, because there's something to be said for getting people who understand the Ohio State way of doing things. But I also I see the, I guess, wisdom, for lack of a better term, or I see the strategy of going away from the Gene Smith influence. Not that you don't respect what he did and appreciate what he did in so many ways for this time, but maybe it's time to go in a completely different way to just bring in a different style of leadership, a different perspective on athletics across the country.
And we've talked about that from the football perspective as well, as the inside hire. Basically, the guy who's already in the building, the guy you already know. When do you go get the guy you don't know? He's just maybe the best person for the job. Maybe Bjork fits that description if maybe he was the best person for the job, even if you didn't know him so well. So that's January 1st, Ohio State's new president started working, Ted Carter. Now they've got a new athletic director starting on July 1st of 2024. And that's your new leadership. That's your leadership. Ted Carter, Ross Bjork, and then Ryan Day as your head coach. That's the expected leadership as Ohio State football takes the field in September 2024 as well. Get the text 614-350-3315 when this news and information came out. The first place we went to, it was in your phones, $3.99, 2-week free trial after that. And listen to Buckeye Talk wherever you find podcasts.